Welcome back to the Seth Leibson Show, Wednesday, September 8th, 2021. A lot to get to today. Got some great guests coming up and a fabulous essay in Newsweek, current issue of Newsweek by Lee Habib. He'll join us in the third hour about an open letter he wrote to his mayor shaming his community on issues of vaccination. Maybe the best thing I've read on it. Our good friend Lee Habib will join us with his piece in Newsweek about that community in Tennessee in which his mayor is attacking people like him, and he'll talk more about that. The countdown to the commemoration this Saturday of 20 years since 9/11 has become yet more interesting. Let's dial back just a moment to recall that when Joe Biden first announced the withdrawal plan from Afghanistan in July, it was timed so that it would be an especially meaningful thing given 9/11. He timed it to commemorate the anniversary of 9/11. And obviously, none of that has worked out, at least not for the purposes it was intended, at least not for Americans to have a good feeling about themselves. Unfortunately, and in an irony of history, our enemies will feel better about themselves on the 20th anniversary of 9/11 than we will feel about ourselves. I'm sure of it. I'm sure of it. The mockery doesn't end. We talked yesterday. I've heard others talking about it today. We've talked yesterday about what it took to bring back the deserter Bo Bergdahl. Took 6 American lives. 6 of his fellow soldiers died trying to find him and rescue him. And then, of course, we negotiated with the Taliban, who was holding him, to give them 5 of the detainees from Guantanamo in exchange for him. 5-to-1 exchange. 4 of those 5 are now in the government of Afghanistan under the Taliban. The ironies and the hits, just as the shame keeps on coming. So you find an interesting thing, don't you? You find, instead of the focus being on this most hallowed of ceremonies in our lifetime, the 20th anniversary of the single greatest terrorist attack on our shores, you would think we would be building up towards more discussion of it. There's very little from the White House on this. In fact, what they told us is that Joe Biden will be giving a major speech tomorrow with a new 6-point plan on COVID. Do understand what's happening here. Do understand that the crisis industrial complex is well at work, so that the crisis is now no longer Afghanistan. It's now the border. It's now COVID. The reason I slipped the tongue is that's how they have moved us. We had a crisis at the border. Unless I missed the bulletin, it never got solved. In fact, I know I didn't miss the bulletin, as I just read a story about 41 pounds of fentanyl seized at the border. Do you know what that 41 pounds could do to this country? 10 million lives is what it could do to this country. Dead. It could take 10 million lives. That's what was seized. Is the border crisis solved? No. So we went from the border to Afghanistan. But to borrow and to paraphrase Barack Obama in compliance with FCC guidelines, don't underestimate the ability of Joe Biden to mess things up. It's a Barack Obama quote. He didn't use the word mess. And so now that Afghanistan, God help us, should be a mess. I wish it were as good as a mess. We now move back to COVID, which is itself a very interesting thing to me. A very interesting thing. Because when Joe Biden spoke at the Democratic National Committee Convention accepting his nomination last summer, we had lost 170,000 Americans with or from COVID. 170,000 when Joe Biden accepted the nomination. At which point he said in his convention speech that there could be no greater symbol of Donald Trump's failure than those 170,000 lives lost. There's a problem, of course. A problem for anyone who wants to just spend a little time on their research machine, be it Google or anything else. You know what that problem is? That problem is that 64% more than that 170,000 have died exclusively under Joe Biden's presidency. 267,000 people have lost their lives from or with COVID since Joe Biden became president. Is that a failure? The way Donald Trump was, according to Joe Biden, last summer? Is Afghanistan? Is the border? I'm waiting for Joe Biden to fix something and not make it worse. I'm off track just a little bit from my earlier thoughts. John Dos Passos, the great novelist, wrote that in times of change and danger, when there's a quicksand of fear under men's reasoning, a sense of continuity with generations gone before can stretch like a lifeline across the scary present and get us past that idiotic delusion of the exceptional now that blocks good thinking. That is why in times like ours, when old institutions are caving and being replaced by new institutions not necessarily in accord with most men's preconceived hopes, political thought has to look backwards as well as forwards. Focus on that phrase about the importance of history being a lifeline across the scary present to get us past the idiot delusion of the exceptional now that blocks good thinking. Has anything better been said to describe what I call the crisis industrial complex? Keep us all in fear, erase our sense of history, just as George Orwell predicted, just as was worried about from every ancient Grecian to Abraham Lincoln in 1838. And we have nothing to look to find the bandages for our own wounds. We jump, in the words of historian Wilfred McClay, who we'll be interviewing on Friday, we jump meaninglessly from lily pad to lily pad without any understanding of the past or the present or the future, and diverting us from any understanding of human things that unfold in time, including the paths of our own lives and history. This is where we are today. This is where we are heading into the 20th anniversary of 9/11. To say nothing of what I worry about with regard to our next big commemoration. I'm not sure what it is, but it might be 2026. It might be 5 years from now, which will be the 250th anniversary of our nation's founding. If 1776 is indeed still conceived of as our nation's founding. Lincoln said it was. The New York Times says it isn't. It's something much closer to 100 years before, 150 years before. We have this at the same time. Gallup tells us that American pride, quote, has continued its downward trajectory, reaching the lowest point in 2 decades of Gallup measuring American pride. Although 42% of adults in the U.S. say they are extremely proud to be an American, 42% is the lowest they have been since Gallup started measuring this. Think about that. Gallup itself tells us 42% is still a good number, even though it's the lowest number. What happened, honestly, what happened to a country that used to understand what the French philosopher Jean-Francois Revel once wrote? Quote, clearly a civilization that feels guilty for everything it is and does will lack the energy and conviction to defend itself, close quote. Stop the guilt. stop the socialism, stop the rewriting of history, and stop the anxious propitiation of our enemies. That would be a good start. Easier said than done, but we're here, you and me, to try and do it together. I'm Seth Liebson, 602-508-0960. We'll be right back.